Hello, everyone. Welcome to the library. Its mission is to provide a showcase for a diversity of literary forms and voices in order to acknowledge and enrich the cultural heritage of Appalachia and the communities around the Little Kanawha River. It is my pleasure to introduce Marie Manilla, our featured writer this evening. Marie is a graduate of the prestigious Iowa Writers Workshop, but she's also a West Virginia native and was Shepherd University's 2021 Appalachian Heritage Writer-in-Residence. She currently lives in Huntington, which is the setting for much of her work, which often grapples with issues of race, class, and gender in the context of Appalachian culture. Marie is an award-winning writer. Her 2014 novel, The Patron Saint of Ugly, won the Weatherford Award and was also the 2021 One Book, One West Virginia Common Read. I could go on and on about her, but I suspect that you're eager to hear from her, as I am. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Marie Manilla.
For that lovely introduction, Jonathan, and for the invitation to be the guest reader today. And a special shout out to Margie Stewart, who I think whispered my name in Jonathan's ear, so I really appreciate that. I first met Max when I visited Glenville State, maybe 2010 or 2012. And then she kindly reached out to me after my novel, The Patron Saint of Ugly, came out because it resonated with her in a way that is every writer's dream. So thank you so much for that. Though I am primarily a fiction writer, I started writing short essays a few years ago, and I absolutely fell in love with the form. In fact, for most of the coronavirus lockdown, I wrote essays exclusively. So I'm going to read two of the fruits of that lockdown labor for you today. And the first is a nostalgic dive into my growing up years in Huntington in the 70s during the Vietnam War. And it's called Bimbo and Smitty and Bags. I spied on them from behind the magazine rack inside the pharmacy. The pharmacist's wife spied them too. She groaned and more vigorously wiped down the soda fountain counter. Across the street, the GVM, Gallagher Village men, sat on the cement wall in front of the grade school my father had attended 4 decades earlier. They weren't men yet, the line of boys that included Bimbo and Smitty and Bags. They were high schoolers ranging from 15 to 18, a ragtag crew of long hairs who wore patched bell-bottoms and army jackets, eyes often glassy from pot. They were routinely blamed for minor mayhem and petty thievery, shoplifting beer, knocking down street signs. Mostly they just loitered on that wall, or the one in front of the branch library, watching the city bus load and unload passengers at the pharmacy bus stop. I never saw them get on a bus. I don't think they rumbled with other local gangs, the EEBs, for example, East End Boys. This was the early 70s. Boys no longer sported ducktails or folded cigarette packs into their t-shirt sleeves. These were no Marlon Brando wannabes. I don't know what they wanted to be. I don't think they knew either. Maybe nobody did, as Nixon sent boys to Vietnam. 334,000 in 1970, 156,000 in 1971. Why get on a bus when your future wasn't in your own hands? Girls in my 7th grade class wore copper POW MIA bracelets engraved with the names of missing soldiers. Every night I watched war footage on the news with my father as anchormen tallied American dead. My 2 oldest brothers were 18 and 19. They weren't aimless. One was in college. One joined the Army instead of waiting to be drafted, a little power grab. My parents drove him to the airport, Steve in uniform with a buzz cut. I often wonder what parting words our veteran dad imparted, if he offered any. He did not cast many pearls, at least not to me. If my parents fretted over Steve, they hid it well. Now I understand. Mom was surely praying for him as she washed supper dishes, darned countless socks. Dad likely offered rosaries, had sympathetic night terrors on his son's behalf. But at the time, their silence to me meant indifference. One Sunday, I cut through the basement where Dad was watching football, Army versus Air Force. Who you rooting for? Air Force. Dad was a World War II airman. I pictured Steve in his Army fatigues, figures. Marie, it was a rare rebuke, and I deserved it. But I truly didn't know how my father felt about his son, how he felt about any of us, really. The GVM crushed on older girls like my sister and her best friend Terry, tried to flirt with them as they strode through Gville. They didn't flirt with me, thankfully, which made it easier to sidle up to Bimbo that summer night he sat on the school wall alone. Moths flittered in the streetlight beam encircling him. I'm not sure why I crossed the street, something in his posture, perhaps his downcast head. He spoke in code about his sister's death. She kicked the bucket, he said. It's the first time I'd heard that euphemism. It took a minute to understand what he meant. Behind him, empty swings on the playground swayed. She died? Yeah. He knocked over an imaginary bucket with his sneaker. Maybe he was bullshitting me, but I believed him. I believed the sadness in his eyes. Or maybe he had no sister, and what he mourned were his options, his birth date that could be plucked from a blue capsule in a lottery. I had no such worries at 13, when my favorite t-shirt was a yellow smiley face. I wore my sunny future like a brag. Within a few years, they were gone, that wall of boys. Some got into deeper trouble and were offered the choice of army or jail. Smitty supposedly drowned shortly after graduating high school. Baggs died of cancer in his 20s, misdiagnosed by the military. By the time his mother got him home, it was too late. I recently found a death notice for Bimbo that I'm not sure if it was him. He died at 53 of some lingering illness. The obituary listed 2 live sisters, no dead ones. Steve made it home alive. He learned to fire mortars, played war games in Hawaiian terrain that was similar to Vietnam's, sent blue airmail letters home that were left on the kitchen table for anyone to read. I don't remember specifics, but they were well crafted and funny. Our family often used humor to deflect having to feel. Once, my parents had friends over for dinner, maybe the Gadbits, the Crickmers. Mom joked that Steve was living the high life in Oahu. I'd like to have that job. Her voice dripped sarcasm. It angered me to hear her say that, to see her make that face, especially with Steve's airmail letter tucked between the salt shaker and napkin holder, as if he were boarding at the Royal Hawaiian, sipping a Mai Tai, not dreading the thought that he might be sent farther west. Or maybe Mom was deflecting too, avoiding the possibility of her son being one order away from Vietnam. Conjuring a cushy tour during her prayers enabled her to fall asleep. Maybe her prayer made it to him, and one night he left Schofield and thumbed into town, ordered a drink in that pink hotel and strolled outside, found a wall to sit on, Diamond Head in the distance, and beyond it nothing but ocean. Maybe his mind drifted on a breeze, and Mom's prayers, carrying him mile after mile to the sun-drenched west coast, over desert and mountains, until he reached West Virginia, then Gallagher Village, where a row of boys sat on a concrete wall, dreading futures they could not possibly foresee. That's the end of that essay. So earlier today, I visited Jonathan's creative writing class, and we discussed the craft element of braiding, which is weaving together often seemingly disparate things into a piece of writing, but by the end, the two or more disparate things resonate with each other. This is how writers add layers and texture that so enrich poetry and prose. So in this next essay, I tried to do just that by weaving together seemingly dissimilar things and experiences, but ultimately they do echo off of each other. And as Jonathan mentioned, the highlight of my professional life was being named Shepherd University's Appalachian Heritage Writer-in-Residence. And when they contacted me to tell me I won the award, they said the reason I was chosen was because my work does explore those issues of race, class, and gender, as well as the urban Appalachian experience. So I touch on most of those things in this following essay, so it's a lovely example of my work. The essay is in two parts, and part one is called Power. We didn't know how to grieve, so I did what I do, kept us busy. That's why we crossed the bridge into Ohio, Mom and I, and aimed for the fairgrounds, parked in a lumpy field. The heat was oppressive, and we linked arms and trudged through dry grass. Should have worn hats, the sun blistering the tops of our heads. Hay bales rimmed the grounds and served as seating. Dancers were already center stage wearing headdresses and leggings and breechcloths. A drum circle reset my heart's rhythm. Outside the bales, stands sold fry bread and beaded earrings and dream catchers, but also hot dogs and hamburgers and pretzels. I bought Mom a drink and found a bale where we sat thigh to thigh. We were both clingy that summer, unbalanced. A slight wind would have tipped either of us over. I wished for a breeze as we sweated in the heat, sipping tart lemonade as children raced back and forth. Mom's eyes followed them. She always loved children. I was more taken by the three old men in full regalia sitting on the bale beside Mom. I don't know how they endured the heat. I'd seen the sign, "Don't take pictures without asking permission." I was too shy to ask. Didn't want to leave Mom's side. Suddenly spouseless, she might topple over without me butted up against her. I slid my camera from my purse, discreetly aimed, and hoped the men were in the frame since I didn't dare look through the viewfinder. Click, click, click. They didn't turn toward the sound, and I slid the camera back in my purse, undetected. Weeks later, when the developed pictures came back in the mail, I found the field centered with tribal flags, several distant dancers, tents with native wares, all permitted shots. The pictures of the three men, however, were covered in smoky wisps, as if light had leaked onto the film, but only on those three frames. Deserved punishment for my disrespect from those men, or maybe from my finger-waving father. Part two is called Powerless. Below us, from the plane window, hundreds of trees downed by the 2012 derecho that knocked electricity out in most of West Virginia. Dawn and I flew away from our powerless house, powerless to do anything, especially in that heat. Plus, the trip was already planned. We rented a car in Minneapolis and started the loop that would clear 6 states off our map: Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana. In our first hotel, we indulged in AC and hot morning coffee. Decades earlier, my sister cleaned rooms in the Travelers Motel in Huntington, an L-shaped single-story motor lodge with a stone facade painted yellow. 10 tiny rooms likely accommodated whole families when road trips were still novel. By the late 70s, when she worked there, it was a dump. The guest residue disgusting, feces smeared on the walls, whether human or dog, she couldn't say. It's even dumpier now. A long-term rental I gawk at when I'm stopped at a red light on Route 60. Plywood covers slots where window air conditioning had been. Bed sheets and oversized flags for curtains, sun-bleached plastic chairs out front, weeds for landscaping. I'm especially drawn to the lone men who occasionally slip from their rooms and head to Jolly Pirate next door, down and out older men. Maybe they sat at the counter with my father who used to drink coffee there. But no, he's been gone too long. I wonder how these men landed there, especially the one I occasionally see pushing a walker across the gravel parking lot. No easy feat. Perhaps he has children missing him or not missing him one bit. After reading Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickeled and Dimed on Not Getting By in America, I try to make light housework for housekeeping, hotel housekeeping. Or maybe it started after Chris relayed her exploits in the Traveler's Motel. At the end of my stay, I'll collect all my trash into one bin, wipe down surfaces, pile used towels in the tub. In West Virginia, the housekeepers are often wiry white women. In the deeper South, usually black. Texas, mostly Latinx. On that trip to the Northern Plains, many were native. It's a commentary on the nature of available work for women of whatever hue. Back on the road in our rental, we headed to the Badlands, as eerie as I'd hoped. Bald hills striated white, pink, and gold, so different from the verdant Appalachians, strip-mined peaks notwithstanding, but beautiful nonetheless. A man at an overlook let me peer through his binoculars at a herd of bison grazing below in the distance, a skimpy remnant of the 30 million that once roamed the Central Plains. Though it's true I wanted to see this spooky landscape, visiting the Badlands was a proximal ruse. When I taught early American Lit, I included selections from native orators and writers, Red Cloud, Chief Joseph, Zitkaleh Shah, Black Elk's account of the Wounded Knee Massacre. That's why I wanted to go there, not to gawk, but to pay respects. Head filled with images of the dead frozen in snow, Sioux men, women, and children, many mowed down by the cavalry's Hotchkiss revolving cannons on that 1890 day. The bodies were unceremoniously dumped in a mass grave. We had to drive through Pine Ridge Reservation to get there, and I said more than once, this could be West Virginia. Dusty roads lined with sun-bleached trailers and slapdash houses, junked cars and appliances in the yards, mutts milling aimlessly. I felt bad for saying it, for thinking it. Sucked back into my father's car when he drove us by those shotgun shacks near the rail yard in the patch. I'll leave you here. I also felt bad for having the means to run away from the derecho's destruction, an inconvenience, not a way of life. That's in part why I overpaid for the dream catcher and beaded necklace from the native woman selling them at the Wounded Knee Memorial on Cemetery Hill, the site of that mass grave. What else could I do? With a baby on her hip, as we stood on the very rise from where those Hotchkiss cannons had been fired. My mother would have held her arms out for that baby. My mother-in-law would have tucked a few bucks into the mother's palm. I didn't regret overpayment, even after an official sauntered over to tell us to buy authorized goods only from the gift shop. It was meant to be a way to dip our toe into Nebraska and check it off our list. White Clay was just a dot on the map, a one-street town of a dozen weather-worn buildings and 10 inhabitants, according to the 2010 census. Badlands of a different kind that sold 4.5 million cans of beer per year. That's a lot of beer for 10 people. The residents of Pine Ridge, 2 miles north, did most of the buying. since selling alcohol on the reservation was prohibited. I didn't want to see what I was seeing outside the 4 beer-selling establishments, all white-owned. Clusters of Native men, mostly, slumped over on curbs, some passed out, drunk. We never want to see stereotypes come to life. See? The damning blanket thrown over whole peoples. It's not racism, the White County Commissioner said in defense of those liquor stores eager to make a profit off alcoholism. It's just good old American supply and demand. I didn't take any pictures of those slumped over men. Didn't pull out my camera to clandestinely aim and shoot. Even if I had, I doubt the pictures would have come out cloudy like the illegal ones I took of those regalia-clad men at the powwow years before. In their present state, those inebriated men likely didn't have enough power to fog film. The images shot me back to store vestibules in downtown Huntington, where I'd seen homeless folks hunker down against the elements, or passed out, or drunks shambling around outside the city mission. They weren't allowed inside under the influence, so they'd bounce off the outer walls. More recently, though, it was individuals OD'd in gas station bathrooms that made the nightly news. Whole clusters Narcaned back to life in shooting galleries. The Sackler family, who owns Purdue Farmer, made millions over peddling Oxycontin in West Virginia, the drug that jump-started thousands of habits. In a 10-year period, nearly 21 million pills were sold in Williamson, population 3,200. The Sacklers don't have to crash in vestibules and shooting galleries. They live cushy lives in Boca Raton. In their books, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, Chris Hedges and Joe Sacco spotlight 4 American regions they refer to as sacrifice zones. White Clay is one of them, as is Welch, West Virginia. These are areas of the country that have been used up and spit out in the name of capitalism, natural resources and people's health gobbled up, profits often funneled out of state. Once drained, the residents are abandoned, left in environmental and existential crises. Alcohol salves the ache, as do drugs. It's a despairing reality that's hard to look at head on. White Clay was hard to look at, and I was eager to leave. Lucky for me, I could. As we drove away, I fumbled with the map, told Dawn to take a right here, a left there. We aimed for the next state line, the next reserved hotel, where women were no doubt at that very moment going floor by floor, room by room, stripping sheets, wiping surfaces, vacuuming, back-breaking labor in the service of people with means. A little uplifting read for Thursday night. That's all that I have for you in the way of reading tonight. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Or if you'd rather just attack me by the food table, I'm okay with that as well. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try. Yes.
In your first reading, you mentioned your brothers. How did your brothers impact your life? That's a big question, but I guess as a writer, or have you reflected on that? What kind of role did they play in who you became?
You know, I think I'll approach this in the way of the dynamics in my family. You're writing about fathers and sons. I was born in an era where the male children were a little more prized than the women, the girl children. So I noted kind of that discrepancy throughout life. Like my dad bought my son My dad bought his sons Exxon stock early on to get them started, but he didn't buy any for my sister or me, you know. And that's not being exactly fair, because he did put me through college, so he did want all of his children to be educated. But there was always a deference to, I think, what the boys would accomplish, what they would do. In fact, when they found out that they had their first son, my dad said, "We have our heir. We have our heir." He was Italian, very, very, very Italian. So I think I grew up learning and understanding that gender inequality, and even my mother, who loved me and loved my sister, she still, until her dying day, deferred to her sons for the big decisions and, well, what would Phil do, and maybe I should ask this. So it was a little weird juggling act. Maybe you all have that in your own family still too. So in that way it impacted me in that way. Thanks. Good question. Anybody else? If not, let's eat. And you can chat me up out there.
Yeah,
It's
thank you,
quieter.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
She has some books.
Yes. And that's my husband, Don, who was with me on that trip to the Badlands, so he can confirm everything happened.
So if you'd like a book, please see Dawn. And I'm sure Mary will be happy to sign the
Happy to
book.
sign
And
it.
she's going to hang out for a little while longer, so please come talk to her.
Yes,
thank
thank
you,
you.
everyone, for being here. Appreciate it.
Grab food.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
But that's what I'm writing these days.
Hey, anytime you tell the truth.